Next, in our Capital Insight segment, we speak with Ralph Martire of the Center for Tax and Budget Accountability about where Illinois spends its money and why Illinois has such a large budget deficit. This runs about 7 minutes. Ralph Martire, just about a week after Governor Quinn has delivered his budget, what is your reaction to the governor's budget as he proposed it?
Well, as he proposed it, it's really not much of a final budget at all. I think it's very much a draft or work in progress. And the real quick way to see that is you look at the borrowing he's going to do for sure from banks. It's $4.7 billion, right? And you look at the rest of his budget, there's about $6 billion in expenditures that he's calling for that there's no revenue source to pay for, none. So that's another $6 billion in borrowing, but this time not from banks, but from the providers and the education community, et cetera. I don't see how that's a final budget. I think it's a challenge to legislators who really have not been with the governor on tax increases to step to the plate and vote for tax increases. And I'm not going to say all legislators. The Senate last May passed a pretty significant tax increase. House Bill 174 would generate $5 billion. So this is really more of a challenge to the House to step to the plate. But no, it's a draft document, and I think the one thing that really raises cause for concern if you want to solve problems, if you don't want to just muddle through, is the 1% surcharge for education. You know, Illinois doesn't have a track record of being willing to take bold votes on revenue enhancements when the state's in dire situations. In fact, our last tax increase really came under Governor Thompson 30 years ago. If he gets a 1% income tax increase surcharge for education, that's it. We're not going to see another tax increase for what, 10, 15, 30 years? And if that's the case, we're looking at really cutting the budget somewhere between $7 to $10 billion.
Right now, as we have the budget, the operating budget the governor proposes $27.4 billion. Roughly terms, education takes up, I think, about 40% of the budget, or is it 35?
35.
About 35, and I think it's social services then are about 40.
Well, no, I mean, when you look at the way our budget breaks down, 9 out of $10 goes to 4 things. So number one is education. That includes higher ed and pre-K through 12, consumes about 36% of the budget. Number two is health care. That's 30% of the budget nowadays, and that's rational. I mean, right now in Illinois, over 4 out of 10 employed workers do not get employer-provided health insurance, and in fact, 30% of our state's population is either completely uninsured or on Medicaid. So using 30% of your budget for health care is probably pretty rational. Next comes the human services sector at about 21% of the budget. Now, this is everything from caring for people with mental health and substance abuse issues to homebound seniors, adults with developmental disabilities, abused and neglected kids, all that stuff. That's 21% of the budget. And then about another 5% goes to corrections and other public safety. So you add that all together, that's 91, 92% of the budget, 9 out of $10 just going to those 4 things. And if we have a $10 to $13 billion hole it's a $27 billion overall budget, but really the appropriations for service is about $24 billion. If there's a $10 billion hole in that, $13 billion hole in that, you've got to cut somewhere between 40 to 50% of your appropriations for education, health, human services, and public safety. That's not...
If you don't raise revenue.
If you don't raise revenue. You know, that's not anything, not only is that not politically feasible, it's not what voters would want, and I don't think he even has the legal authority to do that, because some of our federal money for health care, for instances, et cetera, or for education, is tied to specific funding by the state. So he doesn't even have the latitude to cut that much. So really the state is in a horrible position fiscally, and one that cannot be resolved without a revenue increase. The good news, if there can be good news about a tax increase, is overall we're a very low tax state. I mean, if you consider every tax and fee charged by every unit of state or local government, we rank 46th in tax burden as a percentage of income, right down there near the bottom of the nation, despite having the 5th biggest population and the 5th biggest economy. So even with a substantial tax increase overall at the state level, we'd still remain very low tax, probably bottom 10, no worse than bottom 12.
Is that also true if you factor in the local property taxes?
Every local tax and fee. So driver's license fees, hunting fees, your cigarette taxes, your alcohol consumption taxes, your property, everything to support any unit of state or local government. Illinois is a very low tax state. And you know, it's really, we haven't gotten bang for that. our economy, despite being 5th largest overall in the nation, has lagged the nation and the Midwest, which are both much higher tax than us, in growth for 30 years. You know, we got to figure out that we're doing something wrong at the public sector level here, and what we've really done wrong in a modern economy is disinvest in infrastructure, disinvest in education, and not have a stable revenue system that attracts high-end businesses into our state.
So just to wrap, with the gubernatorial campaign already starting, we have Governor Quinn proposing a tax increase, although less than what you suggest we would need, and Senator Brady on the Republican side saying we shouldn't raise taxes at all. Your opinion of what you just said is that we can't get there without raising taxes?
No, I think it's disingenuous, and I think it's very interesting. The people that say that we could get there by cutting never get very specific about what they would cut, do they? They just say things like across the board or et cetera, et cetera. It's meaningless. And what they don't want to do is tell voters, really, I'm going to cut those services for homebound seniors. I am going to cut caring for abused and neglected kids. I'm going to cut access to health care for low-income working moms. I'm going to take that away from them, because that's what you'd have to cut. And so it's really unrealistic, and it's really deluding voters into thinking they could have public services without paying for them. Frankly, it's irresponsible. I mean, you got to give Governor Quinn credit for one thing. He's told voters what they need to hear, not what they want to hear. The state has to have a tax increase. That takes courage, and I think that takes integrity for any elected official, especially someone like the governor, who's so high profile, to step up and say. And I think no one, if you just look at the numbers, can deny it. I mean, some of the most conservative groups in the state, like the Civic Federation, for instance, are now saying you need a tax increase right along the lines of what we've said you've needed for 7 years. So the numbers are compelling, and it really, if you're going to pay attention at all to the facts, you have to have a tax increase. You really can't solve our problems without one.
Ralph Martire, thanks for joining us.
Okay, thanks.
You're watching the Illinois Channel, an independent nonprofit corporation formed to provide gavel-to-gavel coverage of Illinois state government and other public affairs events taking place across Illinois.